Story number 1.
It was about 2 years ago, but I still laugh when I remember it, despite the awkwardness of the situation at the time. My mother-in-law, Ellen, had asked me to help her with chores at their country cottage. Ellen had always been a tough woman, and her stubbornness meant that there was no way I could shirk the task, no matter how much I wanted to. So, with a sigh and a reluctant smile, I agreed. I gathered a few essentials: a pair of sturdy gardening gloves, my trusty shovel, and a bottle of joint pain medicine my doctor had prescribed. At my age, everything hurts after a hard day's work, and I knew I would need the pills to keep me from getting tired. As soon as I pulled up to the cottage, Ellen greeted me enthusiastically, jumping up with her arms outstretched. "There's my knight in shining armor," she joked, hugging me warmly. I smile, responding politely, "Glad to help, Ellen." Just as I was about to ask what the plan was, my father-in-law, Richard, came out of the house. He was a little slower than Ellen, moving with the cautious steps of a man who had spent a lifetime in hard labor. He patted me on the back with a smirk. "Good to see you, son. Ready for a day of labor?" I smiled back and nodded, stacking my things on the porch. I stashed my meds in the kitchen drawer where I usually kept them and joined the two of them for a hearty lunch. Ellen was a fantastic cook and always cooked in a way that could feed an entire army, which suited Richard and me just fine. After lunch, Ellen took me out into the garden. The cottage stood on a large plot of land surrounded by greenery. There were beds that needed tending, weeds that overgrew, and flower beds that could use a little love. It wasn't particularly hard work, but after a couple hours, I could feel the strain creeping into my joints. My back was starting to ache, my knees were getting stiff, and my hands were getting damp from pulling unyielding weeds. By the time I decided to take a break, Richard had already retired to his favorite workshop, a small shed in the back of the property. There, he had an old radio and a few dusty bottles of whiskey, which he sipped when Ellen wasn't paying attention to him. It was his sanctuary, a place where he could fiddle with his tools and reminisce about his younger years. Meanwhile, Ellen bustled around, organizing and fixing up the house. I slipped inside for a breather. The first thing I did was ask Ellen where Richard had gone. She sighed with annoyance and rolled her eyes. "He ran off to his barn again," she said. "Probably meeting up with his buddies to play poker. That man can't stay still for 5 minutes." I grinned and decided not to pry for details. I headed to the kitchen drawer to grab my joint pain pills. But when I opened the drawer, I was faced with a mess of pill bottles jumbled together. It looked like someone had knocked them over, and now they were all jumbled up. I rummaged through the bottles until I found one that looked familiar, popped the pill, and headed for the shower to wash off the dirt and grime from the garden. However, within minutes of getting out of the shower, I realized something was wrong. My body felt different, more energetic, which didn't make sense. My heart was pounding frantically, and a strange warmth was spreading through my body. I didn't immediately realize I hadn't taken my medicine. Curiosity got the best of me, and I went back to the drawer to take a closer look at the vial of pills. And then the truth hit me like a ton of bricks. I had taken Richard's pills, and they weren't for joint pain. They were for something else entirely. Let's just say they were supposed to help with his performance in bed. A wave of panic swept over me, and I immediately began to feel its effects. My heart pounded in my chest, my arms went stiff, and a strange tension built up inside. I tried to calm down, sitting on the couch and telling myself it would pass. But then Ellen burst into the living room. "Will you help me do something in the barn?" she asked, not noticing my flushed face. "Sure," I stammered, standing up too quickly and feeling a rush of blood that made me dizzy. I followed her outside, but every step I took seemed to increase my discomfort. As we worked, Ellen's presence began to affect me in ways I hadn't expected. I couldn't rid myself of the strange thoughts creeping into my mind. She had always been my mother-in-law, an older woman I respected, but suddenly I found myself looking at her differently. She noticed something was wrong. "Are you okay? You look a little flustered." I laughed nervously, brushing her off. "I'm fine, just a little tired." But inside, I was far from fine. I was embarrassed and confused. As we continued to work, I couldn't help but cast glances at Ellen. Her laughter seemed brighter, her movements more graceful. I began to feel guilty, not knowing why I was having these thoughts. She was my mother-in-law, for heaven's sake. But the pills were stupefying my head, amplifying every little detail until it became overwhelming. After a while, Ellen suggested we take a break. We returned to the house, and I sank heavily onto the couch, struggling to calm my frantically pounding heart. Ellen sat down next to me, concerned. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked again, her voice filled with genuine concern. And that's when I couldn't hold back any longer. I spilled the whole truth, explaining that I had mixed up my pills and had taken Richard's by mistake. At first, she burst into laughter that spread across the room, but when she realized the seriousness of the situation, her expression softened. "Well, this is certainly unexpected," she said, still chuckling. "But don't worry, we can handle it. I think the best thing you can do right now is rest until it passes." I nodded, grateful for her understanding. We spent the rest of the afternoon in silence, me trying to keep my thoughts to myself, and Ellen offering tea and jokes to lighten the mood. She even mentioned that Richard had once gone through something similar, though she didn't go into details. Despite the awkwardness of the situation, it made me laugh. Evening was approaching, and Richard had finally returned from a day out with friends. He seemed to be in a good mood and joked around as we sat down to dinner. Ellen and I exchanged knowing glances, silently agreeing not to mention the strange events of the day. By the time dinner was over, the effects of the pill had almost worn off, and I was finally able to relax. That night, lying in bed in the guest room, I couldn't help but reflect on the day's events. It was embarrassing, no doubt, but in retrospect, it was also hilarious. I never imagined I would find myself in such a situation, and yet I was laughing to myself in the dark. Over the next few days, things returned to normal. Ellen treated the incident as a funny story to be filed away, and Richard remained in the dark. We continued to do the usual chores around the house, and I even helped Richard fix up his shed. There was something comforting about these moments, two men working side by side, swapping stories about their past, laughing about the little things. But there was another unexpected twist ahead. On the last day of my visit, as we were finishing gardening, Ellen pulled me aside. A sly grin appeared on her face. "You know," she said, "there's one more thing I haven't told you about Richard's pills. They're not just for that." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "They also help with stamina," she continued, her grin growing wider. "Maybe that's why you lasted so long in the garden." We both burst into laughter, the kind of deep, genuine laughter that comes from shared secrets and family bonds. It was the perfect ending to an unforgettable weekend that I will always remember with a smile, even if it still makes me blush a little. And as strange as it is, the experience was another memory in a long list of stories I've collected over the years that I'll be telling for as long as I can, with some careful edits for more sensitive ears. Story number 2. My mother, Gabriella, was a devout Catholic. I knew this because she told me about it every day for as long as I can remember. She was a regular at the village church, but she didn't just attend on Sundays. For years, she had been in the habit of attending private Bible studies with Father Santini, the young assistant to Monsignor Cavalli, the venerable priest who had led our parish before I was born. Gabriella signed up for these classes almost every Tuesday and Thursday until Father Santini left to start his own church in a neighboring province. I was not religious myself, but my mother seemed to draw comfort from it. She always returned from these séances with lightness in her gait and a blush on her cheeks. After Father Santini left, however, something changed. Mom became quieter, more withdrawn, and seemed to be constantly burdened with something. The brightness she carried within her after her séances faded, and she often seemed immersed in thought, especially during quiet moments at home. One evening, returning from working in the vineyard, I noticed the tension in her face. Her movements became jerky, and she lashed out at me over something as trivial as not shining my shoes properly before entering the house. I was 19 at the time, and still living at home helping my family with the wine business. But even with my limited awareness of emotional subtleties, I could see that she was concerned. "Is everything okay, Mom?" I asked. She was sitting at the kitchen table, peeling garlic for dinner. Gabriella threw me a look I couldn't decipher. "Why do you ask, Matteo? It just seems to me that you've been out of sorts lately," I said cautiously. She shook her head dismissively. "I'm fine. Don't worry." But her words didn't convince me. Still, I knew it was best not to insist. My mother was closed off, even to me. The next morning, my father, Luca, went on one of his frequent trips to town. My father was a man of few words, stoic and pragmatic. He handled the business side of the vineyard, communicating with suppliers and buyers, while I and the rest of the workers did manual labor. Breakfast that morning was quiet as usual. Mom didn't say a word. Her mind was clearly on other things. But she was dressed more elegantly than usual, in her favorite red dress and dainty earrings, as if she were preparing for something. That was unusual. "Matteo, when you're done feeding the animals, come back soon. I need to talk to you," she said abruptly after breakfast. "About what?" I asked curiously. "I'll tell you when you get back. Now hurry up." I finished my chores, puzzled by the strange request. When I returned, my mother was waiting for me in the living room. She gestured for me to sit next to her on the couch. "Matteo," she began, her voice steady but soft. "You are a man now. And as a man, you have certain responsibilities." I nodded, not realizing where this was going. My mother was not the type to speak so cryptically. She continued, "Your father, he has failed me in certain matters." "What do you mean, Mother?" "There are responsibilities between husband and wife," she said, lowering her voice almost to a whisper. "The church doesn't always talk about them openly, but they're very important. And your father, he's been neglecting those duties for years." I froze in place, unable to comprehend what my mother was saying. "I've talked to Father Santini about this in the past," she said. "He helped me in times of need. But now that he's gone, I feel lost. Mom, I don't understand." "Your father's absence has left a void, Mateo. A void that needs to be filled. You're the only one I can trust to do that." I stared at her, my thoughts racing. What was she implying? The room was stuffy, and I suddenly felt like getting some air. "I need to step outside for a minute," I stammered out, rising to my feet. "Mateo, wait," my mom called out to me, but I was already out the door. After that strange conversation, the days passed quietly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. My father returned from his trip, oblivious to the tension in the family. He went about his business as usual, while my mother became more withdrawn and secretive. One evening, I overheard a heated conversation between my parents. Their voices were muffled, but the tone was clearly hostile. Shortly afterward, my father ran out of the house, leaving my mother in tears. I cautiously approached her, not knowing what to say. "Mom, what's going on?" I asked. She quickly wiped her eyes, trying to calm down. "You have nothing to worry about, Mateo." But I realized that the matter was much more serious than she was saying. The next morning, I found a letter addressed to my father hidden under some papers in the study. Curiosity got the better of me, and I read it. The letter was from Father Santini, a priest who had left our village. It told of a secret relationship between him and my mother, more than just spiritual guidance. My blood ran cold in my veins as I read the frank confessions of their encounters and realized that my mother's Bible studies were a cover for something far more scandalous. I was horrified. My mother, a woman who had raised me with strict religious values, was involved in an affair. And now that Father Santini was gone, she somehow expected me to take his place, something I couldn't even imagine. That night, I came face to face with her. She did not deny it. Moreover, she seemed relieved that the secret was finally out. "Mateo, you don't understand," she said. "I have been lonely. Your father never showed me any affection, and Father Santini, he helped me feel alive again." "But, Mom, that's not right," I said, still trying to comprehend what was happening. Before she could answer, there was a loud knock on the door. Startled, I went to open it. Standing outside the door was a tall man, dressed in black, with a stern expression on his face. "Good evening," he said. "My name is Inspector Rossi. I've come to speak with Gabriella Romano." My heart almost stopped when the inspector stepped inside. He held out a small envelope, a letter from Father Santini, found next to his body after he was found murdered in the town he'd moved to. The priest had been killed under suspicious circumstances, and Gabriella's name had been mentioned in the investigation. The mystery of Father Santini's death unfolded quickly. Gabriella had been implicated far deeper than I could have imagined, and she was now the prime suspect in his murder. The crime shook the quiet village, and rumors began to swirl about the nature of her relationship with the priest. Eventually, it became clear that my mother was not only struggling with her guilt and shame, but was caught in a web of deceit and crime. The once godly woman I thought I knew was leading a double life, and everything came crashing down. When the police took my mother away, our family's secrets were laid bare, and I had to pick up the pieces of a life I never truly understood. The vineyard, the family, and the quiet village will never be the same again. Story number 3. It was not easy to rent an apartment in the city, especially for a student. The cost of living was high, and getting a place in the dormitory was out of the question. It was always full. My parents did their best to help, and luckily, I was able to get a slightly larger scholarship. But it still wasn't enough to cover all my expenses, so part-time jobs became my norm. I was only 1 year away from finishing my master's program, and I was determined to see it through. However, finding a suitable place to live became an obstacle I did not expect to face this late in my studies. I couldn't afford to live alone, and the idea of getting a roommate seemed risky. So when my friend Alice suggested that I move in with her and her mom, it seemed like the most practical solution. Alice lived with her mom, Sarah, a woman in her early 40s who had been single for as long as Alice could remember. Sarah was a strong, independent woman who worked hard, and she reeked of a kind of mystery. She didn't talk much about her past relationships, and there were never any men in the house, so Alice and I assumed she was content with her single life. When I first moved in, things were simple. Alice and I spent time together, and Sarah mostly kept to herself. She wasn't the warmest person, but she didn't interfere in our lives either. Her only rule was to keep the noise down, which was fair enough, considering how often Alice and I were out late. Over time, Alice and I grew closer, and soon she came to me with the life-changing news that she was pregnant. We were both shocked, but the decision to get married came quickly. It wasn't the most romantic proposal, but we knew we wanted to be together, and with the baby coming, it seemed like the right decision. We had a small ceremony and started living in the house with Sarah as a family. As Alice's pregnancy progressed, life became more and more peaceful. I stopped going out with friends as often and focused more on my studies and part-time job. The burden of responsibility was getting heavier by the day, and I realized that I had to finish my studies and find a stable job to support my new family. Alice's pregnancy made her tired most of the time, and Sarah began to take on more responsibilities around the house. Despite her aloof nature, Sarah was always looking out for me. She asked a lot of questions about my studies and future plans, although sometimes her tone sounded judgmental. "What are you going to do when the baby comes? How will you support Alice?" she asked, looking at me intently. I assured her that I was working hard and would find a way to make things work, though I didn't always believe it myself. One evening, after a long day of school and work, I came home to find the house unusually quiet. Alice had gone to bed early, exhausted from her pregnancy. I went to my room to prepare for the next day's lectures, but soon heard a knock on the door. It was Sarah, looking a little disheveled, with a bottle of wine in her hand. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her voice soft and slightly slurred. It was obvious she had already had a drink, but I didn't want to be rude, so I nodded and made room for her. She sat down next to me and poured us both a glass of wine. "You work hard," she said, looking at me with an intensity I hadn't noticed before. "You need to take a break. You're constantly learning, constantly worrying. You're too young for this kind of stress." I smiled weakly and took a sip of wine. "I just want to make sure everything is ready for the baby," I explained. "I have a lot to think about." Sarah leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What about you? What do you want?" she asked, lowering her voice to a whisper. I didn't know how to answer that. Sure, I wanted to finish my degree and provide for my family, but some part of me missed the freedom of my younger years, late nights with friends, carefree weekends. I shrug. I guess I just want to be able to handle everything. Sarah's eyes lingered on me for another moment before she took a long sip of wine. "You're a good man, but you're still so young," she murmured. "You're too young to get so attached. You haven't even lived yet." I felt like the conversation was taking a weird turn, but I wasn't sure how to stop it. I nodded awkwardly, not knowing what to say. Sarah stood up abruptly, smoothing her dress. "Let's go to the kitchen," she said, her tone becoming more commanding. "I brought some food from work. You need to eat." I followed her into the kitchen, where there was already food on the table, left over from what appeared to be a work party. There were salads, cold appetizers, and even a half-empty bottle of whiskey. Sarah poured me another glass of wine and started picking at her food, though she hadn't eaten much. I, on the other hand, hadn't had time to eat all day, so I pounced on the food. While I ate, Sarah watched me silently, sipping her drink. "You're so skinny," she remarked after a while. "Alice doesn't feed you enough, does she?" I laughed nervously, brushing off the remark. "No, she's just tired lately." Sarah nodded, but didn't say anything else. The silence between us grew heavier and heavier, and I kept feeling her eyes on me. After a while, she poured herself a glass of whiskey and drank it in one go. Her face flushed. The alcohol had obviously affected her more than I had realized. "You know," she began, lowering her voice, "I was young once too. I made a lot of mistakes. I didn't settle down when I should have, and now look at me. Alone." I didn't know what to say in response, so I just continued eating, hoping the conversation would turn to something less unpleasant. But Sarah wasn't done yet. "You have so much ahead of you," she continued, twisting her words slightly. "You shouldn't rush into family life. In many ways, you're still a boy. You should be out there, living, experiencing things before it's too late." I looked up at her with confused eyes. "What do you mean?" She leaned closer, her eyes absorbed into mine. "I mean that you're young. You have time on your hands. You don't need to commit yet. You can still explore life." I felt a strange tension build in the room, and before I could respond, Sarah reached out and placed her hand on my arm. "There's so much you haven't experienced yet," she whispered. "Don't you want to find out what else is out there?" Her words hung in the air between us, and for a moment, I didn't realize what was happening. The wine and whiskey had dulled my senses, and Sarah's closeness was overwhelming. She was no longer just Alice's mother. She was the woman standing in front of me, looking at me in a way that made me forget where I was. Before I realized what was happening, Sarah leaned closer, pressed her lips to my ear and whispered, "Let me show you." Something changed between us that night. What started as an awkward conversation over dinner turned into a romance that would last almost a year. It wasn't planned, and it's certainly not something I'm proud of, but it happened. I convinced myself that it was a way to relieve the tension, a way to deal with the exorbitant responsibility I had taken on too soon. Eventually, I found a good job, and Alice and I moved out of Sarah's house and into our own apartment. The affair with Sarah ended quietly, and although we never spoke of it again, there was an unspoken understanding between us. We maintained a warm relationship and remain on good terms to this day. But the memory of that year sticks with me, reminding me of the choices I made and the secrets we carry within us.